The bullet pierced the air just inches from Thomas Ironwood's face, embedding itself in the wooden post behind him as he stood unflinching on his ranch porch. The year was 1878, and in the harsh landscape of Wyoming territory, Thomas had cultivated a reputation as impenetrable as the mountains that surrounded his isolated property. "Your aim's getting worse, Wallace," Thomas called out, his voice a gravelly rumble that matched the weathered lines etched into his sun-beaten face. At 32, he looked closer to 40, life having carved its story into him with an unforgiving hand. The shooter, a rail-thin man astride a paint horse at the edge of Thomas's property, holstered his pistol with a scowl. "Just a friendly reminder of what awaits if you don't sell this god-forsaken patch of dirt, Ironwood. Harrington doesn't make offers twice." Thomas spat tobacco juice into the dust, his steel blue eyes never leaving the intruder. "And I don't give second warnings. Get off my land." As Wallace retreated, Thomas surveyed his property, 500 acres of hardscrabble land he'd purchased with blood money earned from years of bounty hunting. The main house stood sturdy but plain, with a barn, corral, and bunkhouse comprising the heart of what locals had taken to calling Ironwood's folly. No man had ever made this land yield anything of value, but Thomas wasn't trying to prosper, he was trying to disappear. For 3 years, he'd worked alone, refusing help from neighboring ranchers, declining invitations to socials, and turning away every hand who came looking for work. His reputation for solitude was matched only by rumors of his deadly past. Thomas preferred it that way. Silence meant safety, and isolation guaranteed peace, until the stagecoach broke down. It happened on a scorching July afternoon. Thomas was mending fences along his eastern border when he heard the commotion, the crack of a broken axle, the startled whinnying of horses, and the unmistakable sound of human frustration carrying across the open prairie. He ignored it for nearly an hour before curiosity got the better of him. The stagecoach lay tilted awkwardly on the road that skirted his property. The driver and his shotgun rider were struggling with the wheel while 5 passengers stood in whatever shade they could find. Thomas approached slowly, already regretting his decision. "Need some help?" he asked, keeping his distance. The driver wiped sweat from his brow and looked up. "Broke the damn axle. Nearest station's 15 miles north." Thomas nodded. "I know. Reckon we could trouble you for some water while Hank here rides for help. Got ladies and an old man suffering in this heat." Thomas surveyed the group, his expression unchanged. "There's a creek half a mile south." A young woman stepped forward from the group of passengers. Unlike the others who wilted in the heat, she stood straight, her honey-brown hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, though stray wisps had escaped to frame a face flushed with heat. "Sir," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "my name is Zara Ellis. I'm traveling to Larkspur to take a teaching position. These people are exhausted. Surely you could offer more than directions to a creek." Thomas studied her. No more than 25, wearing a sensible traveling dress that had once been fine but now showed signs of a long journey. Her green eyes held a determination that made him uncomfortable. "No," he said simply, turning his horse around. "I couldn't." He heard her indignant gasp but didn't look back, galloping toward his ranch and leaving the stranded travelers in the dust. It wasn't his problem. Nothing beyond his fence line was his problem. He'd learned that lesson at too high a cost. Yet as the sun began its westward descent, Thomas found himself loading his wagon with water barrels, food, and blankets. He didn't examine his motives too closely as he drove toward the disabled stagecoach, telling himself it was merely practical to help them on their way. The passengers had built a small fire by the time he arrived. The relief on their faces quickly turned to wariness as they recognized the unfriendly rancher. Only Zara Ellis stepped forward. "Thank you for reconsidering," she said, no hint of triumph in her voice. Thomas nodded curtly. "Driver can take my wagon to the station. Rest of you can stay at my ranch until he returns with help." An older woman clutched her handbag closer. "At your home, alone, madam," he replied. "I'm offering shelter, not company. Take it or leave it." The driver accepted gratefully, and soon Thomas was leading a procession of weary travelers toward his ranch. He positioned them in the bunkhouse, showed them the pump for water, and pointed out the outhouse before retreating to his main house with a curt, "Keep to yourselves." Later that evening, a knock at his door interrupted his solitary meal. He opened it to find Zara Ellis standing on his porch, holding a steaming plate. "We cooked a proper supper with the supplies you provided," she said. "It seemed only fair you should have some." Thomas stared at the plate, a simple arrangement of beans, corn bread, and what appeared to be rabbit stew. "Not necessary," he said, making no move to take it. "Perhaps not," she replied evenly, "but it's offered nonetheless." When he still didn't take the plate, she added, "Mr. Ironwood, accepting kindness isn't a weakness." The statement struck him like a physical blow. He took the plate roughly and closed the door without a word of thanks. Through his window, he watched her walk back to the bunkhouse, her posture as straight and unyielding as it had been on the road. Thomas ate mechanically, trying to ignore the fact that it was the first meal prepared by another person that he'd eaten in 3 years. The stagecoach company sent repairs 2 days later. Thomas expected to feel relief as the passengers prepared to leave, but instead found himself watching Zara Ellis help the elderly man aboard with a strange emptiness in his chest. "Mr. Ironwood," she said, approaching him as the others boarded, "I want to thank you properly for your hospitality." "Wasn't hospitality," he corrected. "Just practical assistance," she smiled slightly. "Call it what you will, I'm grateful nonetheless." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Safe travels to Larkspur, Miss Ellis." "Actually," she hesitated, "I find myself in need of accommodations in this area." He frowned. "Thought you had a teaching position." "I did. The school board sent word that they've hired someone else, a man with family connections to the town council." Her voice remained steady, but Thomas detected the disappointment beneath her composed exterior. "The driver says there's a small settlement nearby where I might find work until the next term." Thomas grunted noncommittally. Prairie Gulch was indeed only 7 miles away, though calling it a settlement was generous. A saloon, general store, and a dozen ramshackle buildings hardly constituted a town. "I was wondering," she continued, "if you might consider renting me a room temporarily. I noticed you have space in your home and I could earn my keep. I'm capable with household duties, can cook, and no," he interrupted flatly, "don't take in boarders." Zara's expression didn't falter. "I understand. Perhaps you could point me toward someone who might." Thomas sighed, feeling a reluctant sense of responsibility. Prairie Gulch isn't a place for a woman alone. The widow Henshaw has a boarding house in Bitter Creek, 20 miles north. Stage goes through there. She thanked him politely and joined the others. As the stagecoach pulled away, Thomas told himself the matter was settled. He had his solitude back. It was for the best. 3 days later, Zara Ellis returned, riding a mule and leading a second one laden with trunks. Thomas was chopping wood when she appeared in his yard, looking travel-worn but determined. He lowered his axe slowly. "You're headed the wrong way for Bitter Creek." "I've taken a position at Prairie Gulch," she announced, dismounting with practiced ease. "They need someone to teach the children, and the saloon owner's wife has offered me a room, but it won't be ready for 2 weeks while they repair the roof." Thomas's jaw tightened. And you've come here because I need temporary lodging and you have space." She straightened her skirt. "I can pay, not much but something, and I'll earn my keep." "Miss Ellis," he said, his voice low with warning, "I live alone for a reason." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "Yes, and the entire stagecoach heard about your reasons from the driver." Former bounty hunter turned recluse. Dangerous past. Unfriendly disposition. "I'm not asking to be your friend, Mr. Ironwood. I'm proposing a business arrangement." Thomas felt a surge of anger. "You don't know what you're asking, or who you're asking it of." "I know exactly who I'm asking," she replied calmly. "A man with empty rooms and a reputation for saying no. I'm asking anyway." He turned away, driving his axe into the chopping block with unnecessary force. "2 weeks," he growled finally. "Not a day more. You stay in the bunkhouse, not the main house. You leave me be." Zara nodded, the barest hint of relief crossing her features. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he muttered. That evening, Thomas ate alone as usual, though the sound of movement from the bunkhouse kept intruding on his thoughts. He'd given her strict instructions to keep to herself, yet he found himself listening for her footsteps, wondering if she'd try to bring him food again. She didn't. The next morning, however, he emerged from his house to find his porch swept clean and a pot of coffee warming on his stove. No sign of Zara herself, though he spotted her in the distance, hanging laundry on a line she'd strung near the bunkhouse. Thomas poured the coffee, inspecting it suspiciously before taking a sip. It was good, strong, and hot. He carried the cup with him to the barn, passing Zara without acknowledgement. "Good morning, Mr. Ironwood," she called pleasantly. He grunted in response. This pattern continued for 3 days, Thomas finding small tasks completed around his property, Zara maintaining a polite distance, while somehow making her presence known through acts of quiet service. On the 4th day, he returned from checking his cattle to find her in his vegetable garden, pulling weeds with methodical determination. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said, dismounting. Zara sat back on her heels, wiping perspiration from her brow. "Your garden was being overtaken." Seemed ashamed to waste good growing space. Thomas approached, noting how she'd organized the struggling plants, cleared pathways, and even set up a rudimentary watering system using an old barrel. "Where'd you learn gardening?" he asked despite himself. "My father was a physician in Ohio," she explained. "Mother died young, so I ran the household. We always kept a kitchen garden." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I've made a stew. There's plenty if you'd care to join me." Thomas started to refuse automatically, then hesitated. The garden was the best it had looked in years. "Why are you doing this?" she considered him thoughtfully. "Because it needs doing, and because I believe in paying my debts." "You're paying rent, no debt beyond that." "There are different kinds of debts, Mr. Ironwood." She gestured toward the bunkhouse. "Supper will be ready at 6, if you're interested." He wasn't going to go. Thomas told himself this repeatedly as he washed up that evening. He had no intention of breaking his routine for a temporary boarder who would be gone in 10 days. Yet at 6 o'clock, he found himself walking toward the bunkhouse, drawn by the aroma of proper cooking and something else he couldn't name. Zara looked up from the small table she'd set when he knocked on the open door. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "Just checking that you haven't burned the place down," he muttered, but he took the seat she offered. The stew was hearty, the bread fresh, and the company to Thomas's surprise not entirely unwelcome. Zara didn't press him with questions or force conversation. Instead, she spoke of practical matters: the garden's progress, a loose board on the bunkhouse steps she'd repaired, the weather's impact on the nearby crops. Thomas found himself responding in kind, offering gruff advice about the garden soil and warning of early frosts. It was the longest conversation he'd had in years, yet somehow it didn't feel intrusive. As they finished eating, Zara finally asked, "How long have you lived here alone?" Thomas stiffened. 3 years. And before that, he stood abruptly. "Appreciate the meal." Zara remained seated, her expression calm. "I apologize for prying. It won't happen again." Thomas paused at the door, feeling unreasonably guilty. 3 years isn't so long, he said finally. "Some folks go their whole lives without company." "True," she agreed. "Though I've observed it's not always the absence of people that constitutes loneliness, but the absence of connection." He left without responding, unsettled by her perception. That night, Thomas lay awake longer than usual, his mind circling around unwelcome memories, faces of men he'd tracked and killed for bounties, the family he'd lost to his own reckless pursuit of justice, the blood-soaked path that had led him to this self-imposed exile. The next morning, Thomas rode out early and returned late, deliberately avoiding the ranch house. This continued for 2 days until a summer storm forced him back before sunset. As he approached the ranch, he saw smoke from both chimneys, his house and the bunkhouse. Entering his own home, he found a fire burning steadily in the hearth and a covered plate on the table. He was reaching for the plate when a crash and scream from outside sent him running, gun drawn. The wind had torn a branch from the old oak near the bunkhouse, sending it crashing through the roof. Rain poured through the gaping hole, and Thomas found Zara frantically trying to move her belongings away from the deluge. "Get to the main house," he ordered, holstering his gun and grabbing her trunk. Together they salvaged what they could, relocating her possessions to Thomas's front porch. Soaked to the skin, they finally retreated inside as thunder cracked overhead. "Your room," Thomas said, leading her down the hallway. "Only spare one. Not much, but it's dry." The room was small and plain, a bed, chest of drawers, and small table with a basin. Thomas had used it for storage, but it remained cleaner than the rest of the house. "Thank you," Zara said, water dripping from her clothes onto the wooden floor. Thomas gestured awkwardly. "I'll, let you change. Kitchen's stocked if you're hungry." He retreated to his own room, changing quickly before stoking the fire in the main room. The storm raged outside, but inside the house felt different, warmer somehow, despite the chill of the rain. Zara emerged wearing a simple house dress, her damp hair braided down her back. She looked younger, more vulnerable than the composed teacher he'd come to expect. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, taking a seat by the fire. "I can return to the bunkhouse once the storm passes." Thomas shook his head. "Roof's damaged, not safe." He cleared his throat. "You can stay here, until it's fixed or until you leave for Prairie Gulch, whichever comes first." She studied him for a moment. "That's very kind." "It's practical," he corrected, echoing their earlier conversation. "Nothing kind about it." A small smile touched her lips. "As you say, Mr. Ironwood." The days that followed brought an uneasy adjustment. Thomas, accustomed to complete solitude, found himself constantly aware of Zara's presence in his home. She moved quietly, respected his space, and continued her pattern of helpful industry cleaning areas long neglected, organizing his chaotic kitchen, and preparing meals that made his own cooking seem pitiful by comparison. Despite his initial resistance, Thomas found himself engaging more. Brief conversations extended into longer discussions. He began returning home at regular hours. When she mentioned needing to visit Prairie Gulch to discuss her teaching position, he offered to drive her rather than letting her ride alone. The small settlement was exactly as Thomas had described, rough and barely deserving of a name. The saloon dominated the main street, with a general store, blacksmith, and scattered homes completing the picture. Thomas noticed how men's gazes followed Zara as they walked toward the makeshift schoolhouse, little more than a converted storage building behind the general store. "Miss Ellis," called a harried-looking woman with 3 small children clinging to her skirts. "So glad you've come." "I'm Martha Jenkins." We corresponded about the teaching position. As the women talked, Thomas surveyed the town with growing unease. This was no place for a woman like Zara, educated, refined, and entirely too trusting. The men gathering outside the saloon were the sort he'd hunted in his previous life, hard men with few morals and fewer prospects. "This is where you'll be staying," Martha was saying, pointing to a small room attached to the saloon. "Once Hank finishes the repairs." Thomas frowned. "That's not suitable." Both women turned to him in surprise. Zara raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Ironwood, I appreciate your concern, but it's not safe," he insisted. "Too close to the saloon, too exposed." Martha looked embarrassed. "It's all we have available, I'm afraid." "Most families here don't have room to spare." Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. "Miss Ellis will continue boarding at my ranch. I can bring her to town for teaching and return her afterward." Zara stared at him. "That's 7 miles each way." "You can't possibly." "I can and I will," he said firmly. "It's settled." On the drive back, Zara finally broke the tense silence. "Would you care to explain what happened back there?" Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "Prairie Gulch is no place for a woman alone." "I'm perfectly capable." "I know you're capable," he interrupted. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Thomas struggled to articulate what he'd seen so clearly: the danger, the vulnerability, the wrongness of placing Zara in such surroundings. "Those men in town. I know their kind. Knew them in my previous life." He gripped the reins tighter. "I spent years hunting the worst of men, can spot trouble before it happens." Zara was quiet for a moment. "And you see trouble in Prairie Gulch, for you?" "Yes," he glanced at her. "The teaching's fine, living there isn't." "So you're offering to drive me 14 miles round trip each day out of concern for my safety?" Her voice held a note of skepticism. Thomas focused on the horizon. "The bunkhouse roof needs proper repair anyway. Might as well stay until you find something better than that saloon room." She studied his profile. "This is the most you've ever said to me at once, Mr. Ironwood." He felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "Don't make me regret it." The arrangement should have been temporary, but as days stretched into weeks, neither mentioned any change. Thomas repaired the bunkhouse roof, but Zara remained in the spare room of the main house. Each morning he drove her to Prairie Gulch, where she taught the dozen or so children whose parents valued education enough to send them. Each afternoon, he returned to collect her, ignoring the speculation their routine generated among the townsfolk. August turned to September, and the landscape began its subtle shift toward autumn. Thomas found himself watching for the changing colors with new interest, pointing out particularly vivid transformations to Zara during their daily drives. She, in turn, began sharing stories from her teaching day, tales of student progress, community characters, and the small triumphs that filled her hours. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Zara asked quietly, "Will you tell me now about your past?" Thomas tensed, but the question didn't carry the same sting it once would have. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps she deserved to know who she was living with. "Was a bounty hunter," he began haltingly. "Good one. Too good. Started young, 18, angry, looking for purpose after the war took my father. Found I had a talent for tracking, for patience, for finishing the job." Zara listened without interruption as Thomas described his former life, the years spent pursuing wanted men across territories. the reputation he'd built, the fortune he'd amassed from blood money. Had a wife once, he continued, his voice growing rougher. Sarah. Married her in Colorado when I was 26. She knew what I did but thought I'd change. I promised her I would after one last big bounty. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant call of night birds. "What happened?" Zara finally asked. Thomas stared into the darkening sky. "Tracked a murderer named Blackfield for 6 months. When I finally cornered him, he had friends waiting, got away in the fight, somehow discovered who I was where I lived." His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "Found Sarah when I wasn't home, left her for me to find. Message carved into our table. Hunters become the hunted." Zara's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the growing darkness. "I spent a year hunting them all down," Thomas continued, his voice hollow. "Every last man involved. Didn't collect bounties anymore, just dealt justice. When it was done, I was empty, bought this land because nobody wanted it, figured I'd disappear here." "And have you?" Zara asked softly. "Disappeared?" Thomas turned to look at her, really look at her for perhaps the first time. The fading light caught the amber tones in her hair, the compassion in her eyes. "Thought I had," he admitted. "Until you showed up." The confession hung between them like a tangible thing. Zara reached across the space separating their chairs and placed her hand over his. Thomas stared at their joined hands, unable to remember the last time he'd experienced such simple human contact. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Thomas nodded, unable to form words around the knot in his throat. They sat in silence until stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, neither pulling away. The next morning, Thomas was more withdrawn, uncomfortable with his vulnerability from the night before. He drove Zara to town in silence, nodding curtly when she told him she'd be working late helping Martha with preparations for the harvest festival. "I'll return at sunset," he said, already turning the wagon around. The day stretched endlessly as Thomas attempted to lose himself in ranch work. By mid-afternoon, strange riders approached his property, 3 men he recognized from the saloon in Prairie Gulch. Thomas met them at the edge of his land, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Ironwood," the leader greeted him, a tall man with a jagged scar across his left cheek. "Hear you've been playing escort to the new schoolteacher." Thomas's expression remained impassive. "What business is that of yours, Sawyer?" "Just wondering about your arrangement," Sawyer replied with a smirk. "Pretty young thing like that, living with a man of your reputation." "State your purpose or get off my land." Sawyer leaned forward in his saddle. "Some of us were hoping to make Miss Ellis feel welcome in town, special kind of welcome. Thought you might be standing in the way of that." Thomas's hand tightened on his pistol. "You come near her, you die." The threat hung in the air, lethal in its simplicity. Sawyer's companions shifted nervously, but the leader maintained his smirk. "Heard you gave up the killing business, Ironwood. Word is you've gone soft." In one fluid motion, Thomas drew and fired, the bullet kicking up dust inches from Sawyer's horse's hooves. The animal reared in alarm. "Next one won't miss," Thomas promised, his voice cold. "Spread the word Miss Ellis is under my protection. Anyone who doesn't respect that answers to me." The men retreated, throwing dark looks over their shoulders. Thomas watched them go, a familiar rage building within him one he hadn't felt since his hunting days. The need to protect, to eliminate threats, to ensure safety at any cost. He rode into Prairie Gulch earlier than planned, arriving at the schoolhouse to find Zara assisting the youngest children with handwriting exercises. She looked up in surprise as he entered. "Thomas, is something wrong?" The use of his given name, the first time she'd addressed him so momentarily, distracted him from his purpose. "Need to speak with you, privately." The concern in her eyes deepened, but she nodded, instructing the children to continue practicing before stepping outside with him. "What's happened?" she asked. Thomas explained the encounter with Sawyer and his men, watching her face pale as she understood the implicit threat. "You can't stay here," he concluded. "Not in this town, not with men like that." Zara wrapped her arms around herself. "But the children find another teaching position. Bitter Creek, Larkspur, anywhere with proper law." He softened his tone. "These children aren't worth your safety." "Every child is worth, not at this price," he interrupted fiercely. "I know these men, what they're capable of." Zara studied him, her expression troubled. "And what are you capable of, Thomas? Would you return to your old ways to protect me?" The question struck him like a physical blow. "If necessary." She shook her head. "I won't be the reason you become that man again." "Better that then." Thomas couldn't finish the thought, the horror of it choking him. "Pack your things, we're leaving. I have responsibilities, commitments." "Zara." He rarely used her name, and it felt intimate in his mouth. "Please." Something in his voice must have conveyed his desperation, for she finally nodded. "I'll speak with Martha. Explain that I need to leave." They left Prairie Gulch before sunset, Zara subdued beside him in the wagon. Thomas maintained a vigilant watch, pistol within easy reach, until they reached the safety of his ranch. Only then did he allow his tension to ease slightly. "What happens now?" Zara asked as they entered the house. Thomas had been so focused on getting her to safety that he hadn't thought beyond this moment. "You'll stay here until we find you a proper position somewhere safe. And if that takes time, then it takes time," he said simply. "You can stay as long as needed." Zara's eyes searched his. "Why, Thomas? Why are you doing this?" The question hung between them, demanding an honesty he'd avoided for weeks. Thomas turned away, struggling to form words around the emotions he'd denied. "Because I can't lose someone else," he admitted finally. "Not again. Not you." He heard her soft intake of breath, felt her presence as she moved closer. Her hand touched his arm, turning him gently to face her. "Is that the only reason?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked down at her, at this woman who had stubbornly persisted in offering kindness despite his every rebuff, who had seen his scars and darkness and stayed anyway. "No," he said hoarsely, "it's not the only reason." She raised her hand to his face, fingers tracing the weathered lines beside his eyes. "I stayed because I saw something in you from the first day, something worth knowing, worth caring for." Thomas closed his eyes, overwhelmed by her touch, by the tenderness no one had shown him in years. "I'm not worth it, Zara. The things I've done. The past is written," she interrupted gently, "but the future isn't." When he opened his eyes, she was looking at him with such warmth that something inside him, something frozen and dormant for years, began to thaw painfully. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed. "How to be anything but alone." "Neither do I," she admitted. "But perhaps we could learn together." Thomas reached for her then, tentatively, as if she might disappear at his touch. When his arms encircled her, drawing her closer, she came willingly, resting her head against his chest. He held her carefully, this precious, unexpected gift, and felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble. "Stay," he whispered into her hair. "Not because you have to, because you want to." She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want to." The kiss that followed was gentle, uncertain, the first tentative step into unknown territory for both of them. Yet in that moment, Thomas knew with absolute clarity that his life had irrevocably changed. The solitude he had cultivated as protection now seemed like a prison from which Zara had freed him. The following weeks brought changes to Ironwood Ranch. Thomas expanded the garden, built proper furniture for rooms long left bare, and began repairs he'd neglected for years. The neighboring ranchers, noticing the transformation, extended invitations that, to their surprise, were occasionally accepted. Zara wrote to contacts from her teaching days and received word of a position at a proper school in Clearwater, 30 miles east. Thomas accompanied her to the interview, watching proudly as she impressed the town council with her knowledge and passion for education. "They've offered me the position," she told him later as they sat together on their porch. "It starts next term in January." Thomas nodded, tamping down his immediate concern about the distance. "Clearwater's a good town, proper sheriff, decent folks." He hesitated. "It's a long commute from here." Zara took his hand. "I was thinking perhaps we might find a solution that doesn't involve daily travel." "What kind of solution?" She met his gaze steadily. "The kind that involves a preacher, vows, and my name changing to match yours." Thomas stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You're proposing to me," a smile touched her lips. "Someone had to take the initiative." "You're still learning how this works." He pulled her into his arms, marveling at how natural it now felt to hold her. "Zara Ellis, are you certain you want to tie yourself to a reformed bounty hunter with a dark past and a hardscrabble ranch?" "Thomas Ironwood," she replied, her eyes shining. "I've never been more certain of anything." They were married in November, with the mountains wearing their first dusting of snow. The ceremony was small, a few neighbors, Martha and some children from Prairie Gulch, and the circuit preacher who seemed bemused by the unlikely couple. By spring, Zara was teaching at Clearwater while Thomas managed the ranch, which no one called Ironwood's Folly anymore. They divided their time between the ranch and a small house in town during the school term. The garden flourished under Zara's care, and the house became a home filled with books, conversation, and eventually, the sound of children's laughter. Years later, travelers passing by would often stop for water or rest, invited by the welcoming sight of Ironwood Ranch. They would find a weathered man with kind eyes working alongside his wife, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived. Few would guess that this same man had once turned away every kindness, until one woman's persistent goodness had broken through his defenses and taught him that love was worth the risk of pain. For Thomas Ironwood, who had sought to disappear into isolation, found instead that only by being truly seen and loved, despite his past, could he finally find peace.